to the hashtag Relationship Goals webinar on creating boundaries. My name is Michelle Robichaud, and I'm a licensed professional counselor with Counseling and Psychological Services.
And I'm Iris Cahill-Cassiano, one of the doctoral interns in psychology.
And today we're just really going to talk about boundaries. And so we wanted to pose this question at the start of the webinar, which is, what are boundaries and why are they important? And really, boundaries are based off of our personal and cultural experiences. So we define for ourselves what boundaries are. So sometimes within our culture of origin or our family of origin, we might have learned what certain healthy or unhealthy boundaries are, or what were sort of norms that we had for creating boundaries with others. But through our own personal experiences that we have lived, or the different cultural experiences that maybe we've been exposed to ourselves, those boundaries can change over time, or we might define them in different ways. They reinforce our standards for relationships, so they kind of set guidelines for our relationships for us to follow, or what we expect the people to, how other people should engage with us in relationships. It can be fluid, which means sometimes there can be some flexibility with them, or they can be very defined and concrete. And that will sometimes maybe vary depending on who you have that boundary with. And they can change over time depending on the relationship. An example of that might be, you might have some very clear boundaries with a friend, but if this friend becomes someone that you are maybe more close to, or maybe even a romantic partner, then your boundaries are probably going to look a little different as that relationship evolves. And they set the tone for what we're willing to accept in our relationships and what we are not.
So let's talk a little bit about creating boundaries. And it's worth really spending some time exploring why we have boundaries in the first place. And maybe one of the most important reasons is that boundaries really serve to protect ourselves and our values. So they help kind of shield us and preserve those things that are most important to us in terms of our personal values. They can also be a way to protect others. And so we're really quoting here Dharma Lama Roy Owens, who talks about boundaries really being as a way, if you can kind of engage in that self-care and protect yourself with these boundaries, you're better able to connect with others and feel safer in those relationships. And maybe you're also a little bit healthier in your interactions with others versus holding up pent-up frustration and other negative effects that come from having boundaries that don't feel respected or that aren't protected. We also like to say that in creating boundaries, this is helping to serve as a guideline in relationships, right? This helps us really recognize, okay, what are the things I'm willing to negotiate around or compromise on? And what are some of the things that are so important to me I can't be flexible with, just again, because of my values and where I'm coming from. So that can really help us map out those interactions with others and our relationships. And the other thing to really think about as you work on creating your own boundaries is recognize these are highly personalized. My boundaries would look really different from Michelle's boundaries, for example, and yours might look really different from your friends or family members, because again, this is reflecting your needs and your personal values. So don't feel that there is a cookie cutter, one size fits all as you think about creating and establishing your own boundaries.
Yeah, and to that effect, know that it is okay too if your boundaries change over time, that they don't have to be a certain way just because at one point in time you felt like these were your boundaries. But then as you evolved and you changed, maybe you want to set some different boundaries for yourself, and that's okay too.
Absolutely.
Iris and I did want to talk about examples of healthy versus unhealthy boundaries. And we're going to start with the unhealthy boundaries first. But keep in mind that these, like we have mentioned, boundaries are very highly personalized. So you might not agree with some of the examples that we have here, or you might semi-agree with them, but maybe not fully, and that's okay too. Since boundaries are specific to what we personally believe in, you know, it's kind of vary depending on each individual. But this is just kind of a general guideline to get you thinking about what might be unhealthy boundaries and what might be examples of healthy boundaries. So the first one is disrespecting the values, beliefs, and opinions of others when you do not agree with them. And specifically, what this might look like is if you're being very hostile, maybe even judgmental towards those individuals, or they're being that way towards you.
Yeah, and that segues nicely into the next point of an unhealthy boundary, which is when you feel that you can't say no, even when you're uncomfortable, or not accepting when others say no. So really, an unhealthy boundary is when there's too much flex around those things or those values that really are important for you, and you feel uncomfortable or have a hard time accepting a no.
Yeah. Another example of maybe unhealthy boundaries is if you feel responsible for other people's feelings or happiness, or you are constantly sort of blaming yourself for other people's emotional responses, so that you believe that there's something that you did that is wrong, that caused someone to feel a certain way, or that their happiness is completely dependent on your actions. This can also be in the opposite, where maybe you feel like people need to be responsible for your happiness, that it is other people's job to make you feel happy or to take care of you, which kind of actually goes into the next bullet point.
Yeah, which is again, it's all tied into this feeling of responsibility. In this case, another unhealthy boundary is feeling responsible for fixing or saving others, or feeling that others have that responsibility to fix or save you. Really problematic because again, that's compromising that the agency or that individual responsibility that one has for their own boundaries.
Another, I think, really clear example of an unhealthy boundary is when an individual touches another person without their permission. Now, this might, depending on the touch and depending on the individual who does this behavior, this might not feel like a violation of one's boundary. But as a general rule, um, touching another person's body without their permission tends to be a boundary violation for a lot of individuals.
Yeah, and connected to that is also like if somebody touches you and you don't feel comfortable with that and have not given permission, not like expressing that discomfort and not saying like, hey, that's not acceptable, which ties in really nicely into the next one, the next example of an unhealthy boundary, which is engaging in sexual activity or intimacy without getting clear consent from the other individual, and maybe also like engaging in it when you're not consenting to it, like, or you really don't have the desire, don't feel comfortable doing it, but you engage in it anyway. So again, being mindful of really listening to what do you really connect with and feel in that moment.
Yes, exactly. And then the last bullet point we have here is choosing to isolate or withdraw from individuals in order to avoid closeness. And this can be an example of an unhealthy boundary because if we're choosing to sort of withdraw ourselves from any individual, we're not actually creating healthy relationships. Now, sometimes we do need to isolate and withdraw when maybe we are feeling overwhelmed or maybe we feel hurt by other individuals. But if it's for the purposes of avoiding closeness, of avoiding vulnerability and building intimacy, that can be an example of an unhealthy boundary. It's essentially when we're cutting off any contact with any individual we're afraid we might get close to.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about healthy boundaries. And in a lot of ways, it starts with really valuing your personal boundaries and not compromising them for someone else. Sometimes that can feel a little bit uncomfortable, like if we're not used to prioritizing our own needs and values. But that's the really key part here about being able to protect yourself.
An example of a healthy boundary too is being able to say no and accepting when other people say no. So just because someone says no, and maybe we don't like that answer, we don't try to go around that or make them change their mind. We accept that no, even if maybe we don't agree with it, or we don't like hearing that. We did want to mention here that silence does not mean yes. Silence is an acceptable way to say no. And when we think of sort of consent in relationships, a person's silence does not mean that that is okay for an individual to engage in a behavior that that individual may not want to engage in. But oftentimes, sometimes people can mistake silence for meaning that that individual is okay with their actions when they're actually not. So an example not related to consent, but that kind of highlights this is, let's say as a student, you're working with a professor and the professor, asked if maybe you might be willing to do this project for them. And you're really not comfortable with doing it, but maybe because of the power hierarchy, you don't want to come across as disrespectful and say no. So you just don't respond with anything at all. Let's say a few weeks later, the professor comes back and has assigned you on the project. Well, you never actually said yes to being on the project to begin with, which can feel like a violation of your boundaries because it is, because you never explicitly said that that was something you were interested in engaging in. So this is a helpful reminder to remember that silence is an answer in and of itself. It is a boundary that you are setting, and that you don't always have to say no for you to set a boundary.
Absolutely, absolutely. And some of this ties into the next example that we have of a healthy boundary, which is really knowing who you are and what you want. So this ties into our first video that we had in this webinar series, which really talks about recognizing needs and wants, and also being able to communicate to others, communicate those aspects of who you are and what your needs and wants are in a clear way, whether that be like through saying no or saying yes, or using silence to help communicate what needs to be said.
Engaging in appropriate sharing. And so this might look different depending on what context you're in, depending if this is a friendship, a relationship with a boss or employer or your professor. But this also could depend very much on your cultural upbringing as well, or what cultural context you're in. But this idea that you're not oversharing information with individuals that might take that information and use it inappropriately, but then you're also not keeping yourself withdrawn or isolating yourself, and that you're not able to be vulnerable and open with others.
Yeah, and it's also really important in terms of establishing healthy boundaries to not let others define you or your sense of self-worth, or vice versa, like trying to define others' sense of self-worth and who they are. So really these boundaries that you're establishing for yourselves need to really reflect who you are, and you get to make that decision.
Yeah. And when I hear this bullet point, I think what comes up, for me is this idea of sometimes we can be told that in order to be nice or to seem nice to other people, we shouldn't have these hard, rigid boundaries. But that's actually not true. We can be nice and have clear boundaries. There's nothing saying that we automatically have to let other people walk over our boundaries or not respect our boundaries in order to be seen as nice. Know that your feelings and needs are just as important as the needs and feelings of other people, whoever you're in a relationship with.
And know that you have the right to your emotions and feelings, the same that others do.
This really boils down to this idea of respecting others' values, beliefs, and opinions, while also knowing that you do not have to compromise your own values, beliefs, or opinions. So that kind of idea that we can hold both, that I can respect you and what you believe, even though I may not agree with it, but then I'm also respecting my own values and I'm not going to compromise that as well.
So Michelle and I are going to talk a little bit about what personal boundaries can look like. And we use this great graphic to kind of demonstrate like the different circles of boundaries and who or what might actually take place within those circles. And a lot of that's going to depend on your individual context, your cultural context, like all of that good stuff that kind of helps inform who you are. So, in that green circle where we have the figure of the individual, that's like your inner boundary where things are okay. Like you have, these are kind of like the needs and wants that you have, and that there's an allowance in there, like who is able to be close within that circle of things that you are willing to participate in or like just experience. In that yellow circle, we've got stuff where it starts to be maybe a little bit borderline between okay and not okay, where like maybe depending on the person, so like for example, it could be a family member or a really close friend, you might have a little bit more flex in some of those areas or in some of those boundaries. So like it might be okay for one person and maybe not for another, but there's a little bit of room to navigate that. And then in that outer red circle, those are the things that are definitely not okay or allowed within your boundaries. So these are behaviors that you wouldn't want to engage in or wouldn't want somebody to do to you. Maybe it has a lot to do with trust, like what you're willing to share or not share with others. And that for you is clearly defined that you are not wanting to negotiate or compromise on those boundaries.
So if we think of sort of an example, just to kind of use this chart here, we'll take the example of maybe physical touch. So maybe when we think of giving a hug to someone, so in the okay circle, maybe you are okay with giving a hug to people who are very close to you. So that could be family, maybe a loved one or a partner. Perhaps maybe friends, but that I think varies depending on each individual's preference. In the yellow circle, that might be maybe you're okay with some friends hugging you or some family members touching you, but not others, right? And it kind of just depends on the context, right? But there's some room for flexibility. But then on the outer circle might be some other individuals who you are definitely not okay with touching you or giving you a hug. So maybe that might be your boss, but it doesn't have to be, depending on your relationship with these individuals in the outer circle, or if you become closer to them, they might move into that yellow circle where it might be okay where it might feel okay for you to allow them to express some physical expressions of intimacy. But probably, in this red circle is going to be strangers or people who you're not very close to, or maybe people who you don't feel like you have established this sense of trust with. And so that might be, again, maybe strangers. This might be an employer. This might be a professor, someone who you would feel very uncomfortable engaging in that sort of intimate act with.
Right, so let's talk about next steps. We're inviting you to create a list of your personal boundaries. They can be based on some of the things that we've talked about today, like really looking out for what are healthy boundaries for you and maybe what are some unhealthy ones that you'd like to avoid. We have some questions that Michelle and I would like you to reflect on. Just consider these as you're creating this list, which is like, how are boundaries going to be helpful for you and for your relationships? Really think about, do you know when your boundaries have been crossed? Like, how will you recognize that? And then reflect on what makes setting or creating boundaries difficult for you. And then how can you actually hold those boundaries when you feel pressured by others? So reflecting on this as you compose that list can really help you ground yourself and get connected to boundaries that are going to actually like help you and that you'll be able to hold as you need to. And just to help you with this, Michelle and I have also created, it's just a little worksheet that has these questions and some space for you to list these. We'll be posting that with this video, so feel free to download that resource if that's helpful for you as you come up with personal boundaries.
Yes, and we will have that resource available for you with this video. But in addition, we wanted to mention that we have additional videos in our hashtag relationship goals webinar series. Some topics include communication or healthy versus unhealthy relationships, where we'll have some additional helpful tips as well. But for more in-depth information and ways to cultivate meaningful relationships, you can register for the 3-week in-person workshop by visiting our website at caps.tamu.edu.
Yeah, it's been really great sharing this with you today. We have some additional resources and helpful links. They'll also be included when we post the video, that they're easy to access and link to. But again, we've got some information on healthy versus unhealthy boundaries, loveisrespect.org, and other helpful videos that can help guide you as you create and establish your own personal boundaries.
So with that, we are going to end the webinar today. This is our location if you ever need to contact us, but you can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. Thank you for attending this webinar, and we hope that you enjoy the content of this webinar and that you have found it to be helpful. Take care.